This is centering equity in the CLNA process. Hopefully you all know what CLNA means. If not, you're going to get quite a deep dive into CLNA today. And here in this first session, one of a few that we are trying to offer to you all as you think through your CLNA process, this one is going to focus in on identifying root cause or causes. And it'd be interesting for if you would add in chat, not just your name and institution, but if you've worked on the CLNA process before. If you've been involved in the writing of it, it'd be helpful to hear where you all are. So that way we get a better idea of how much you've done with the CLNA, but also, it'll help us in these next few webinars, help think through, what maybe some of your needs are, more beginner, advanced. So please do share your name, institution, and how you've assisted with the CLNA itself. So first timer, we love first timers. In fact, there are probably many first timers. There's tons of turnover all the time at our institution. So welcome. All right. Welcome, Joel. You feel like you missed a lot. Oh, well, I hope we can help here. Had some exposure, okay? First time, there's so many of you. See, we're in good company. We have a wide range of people who've helped write it. Maybe we're the only writer on the CLA itself, to those who are about to embark on this journey. So why not start with identifying root cause? I'll share at the end of this, some colleagues here from OCCRL and I are putting together the series that we hope will help you think through some of those key pieces of the CLNA. So it's perfect day, Wednesday, to talk about identifying root cause. Please do keep sharing in the chat. It wouldn't be right without us. Starting with just a brief slide here, as OCCRL, the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, are located on the campus of University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And with that, you can see our land acknowledgement. We want to ensure that we at least recognize and acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Keokuk, Wea, Miami, Muskogean, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. We obviously have had to think through this history as a land-grant institution, and I particularly am always, I take a moment to just think about where we sit, especially with the topics that we often talk through. If you think about today in equity gaps, right, I think it's an appropriate way to at least start and center Native peoples as we think through, not just the history of this institution, but our institutions as a whole and the work that we're doing. I also want to make sure that I start with this statement. It's from the Washington State Board for Community and Technical Colleges. It was in a student assessment leaders conference a while back on assessing belongingness and marginality, where they talked through how they acknowledge that our nation and our institutions have benefited from the free and slave labor of Black people. And we recognize that the interconnected histories of Indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from their land and the history of those who were forcibly brought to it. And so with that, we acknowledge the enduring impacts of the African diaspora and honor the contributions, talents, and dreams of our Black communities. We also acknowledge the immigrant labor that has contributed to this country as a critical labor force, including voluntary, involuntary, traffic force, and undocumented peoples. We also recognize and honor their contributions. And so with that, right, just what we're trying to do with this work, hopefully we move beyond awareness to action through meaningful changes at our institutions and in our communities. If you haven't heard much about OCCRL, this is kind of what we're all about. Public engagement, transformative leadership, comprehensive P20 educational pathways with a centeredness on equity-driven change. Hopefully the work that you've seen produced through the years have pushed on equity and centered equity. And so we hope that, again, today is an example of what that looks like. Today's conversation, specific to the comprehensive local needs assessment, which this is what it looks like in case those first timers are not even sure what they're looking at. This is the front page of a document that we assisted with ICCB on, and helping think through an equity-centered comprehensive local needs assessment process, right? You could just do your comprehensive local needs, right? But we're saying, and we talk through why we believe an equity-centered process really does assist institutions in thinking through equity gaps, root cause, all of the different pieces that are needed to help think through our student populations. You'll see the different sections that are a part of this process. There are quite a few, right? It's not just one. This is not a two-page document. Oftentimes it's a bit more. But I think if you're understanding the purpose of this process, right, that the Perkins 5 CLNA helps you hopefully move beyond checklists, right, beyond the compliance piece of this. And hopefully you will see it if you haven't already, right, that it's more data informed, it's a continuous improvement process, that you can hopefully, it's not an annual process, but more of a biannual process, right, to examine and assess your CTE programs. And you have to, in many ways, assure that they align with your local workforce needs as well as their economic needs. And so by using an equity lens to this, it's going to require some disaggregation of data. It's also going to help you hopefully highlight, analyze, and even work towards closing equity gaps for some of the more underserved populations. And we'll go through a little bit of what that means. There's so many resources out there now prior to I'd say even 2020, right? There's so many that have just proliferated in these past few years about disaggregating data, helping you think through exactly the pieces that a CLNA, this equity-centered CLNA will help you do. And so if there's other resources, I definitely will invite you to share them in the chat as we go through. And I'd love to update, even our resources that we have on our page, because we're trying to always, keep up with relevant resources that will help you in your process. This is what this is designed to do, right? Help you. And so you all know that your colleges are required under Perkins 5 to engage a diverse body of stakeholders in the CLNA process. And so hopefully the findings that come from this process will inform not just your community college itself, but your local community, which could include school districts and other workforce bodies, right? To help them think through their Perkins 5 local application for funding. So today's topic on identifying root cause really stems and centers around that second section, student performance. And so if you don't have your CLNA, I suggest you at least pull it up at the moment. If your institution has done one recently, the most recent one would be very applicable at this time. So you can get a little bit more familiar with not just the template itself, but also what your institution wrote if you hadn't seen what they have. And so if you're able to pull it up, definitely do so, because I think it might help you think through some of these questions, as well as, what data you'll need to help answer some of these questions. So if we look under the student performance section, there are a few questions that stuck out that really, I think, helped me think through, what could this webinar itself, when identifying root cause, what could it inform? And so there are a couple of questions. One, what are some of the root causes for the equity and racial equity gaps you identified in your CTE programs? And as you can see, it says, please identify how institutional structures, systems, resources, and practices are the root cause, and refrain from focusing on perceived student deficits as the cause. It's a big question, and could, balloon into quite a few ideas or thoughts. And so I like the emphasis here on not perceived student deficits, but how can we attack the system? Another question that popped up within the process is, how are your CT students performing in certain developmental courses to high wage and high demand sectors compared to non-CT students? And are there differences in that performance in developmental courses based on subpopulations? If so, what are the key differences and what may be the root cause of these differences? As well as, are there differences in performance in developmental courses based on race and ethnicity? If so, what are those key differences there, right? So helping think through a bit more segregation. I think the key here is that high wage, high demand sector. So we're going to talk through those, but I want to back up for just 1 minute and kind of get us situated where we are right now, right? This is Lumina Foundation puts together their data specific to their goal 2025, right? 60% of Americans having credentials. And so when they started, you see that at least that 40% attainment rate to that 60% goal on the right-hand side that's more green. They've looked at each of the states, and this is the most up-to-date map of where we are. And so it varies from state to state. If you see Illinois right now, we're at 56.9%. To a place like DC, which it's interesting when you talk to people from DC, they're like, we need to have more of a conversation about what that is. How are we at 72%? Who's not included and who is? But in looking at this, right, we're trying to get to the 60% goal. Right now, we're at about 53.7%. And so within that, we recognize and acknowledge that community colleges have been incredibly important and moving even to that 53.7%, because we know that they weren't, certificates weren't included initially, right? There was a focus on just degrees. And so if we look at just that data, we know, and Will Del Pilar at EdTrust says, if we're going to close any racial and ethnic gaps in completion, we have to have data disaggregated, and colleges have to take a bigger role in ensuring that their students are graduating. Right? This was back in 2018. We knew this even before then, but we continue, right, to see and hear the need. If you look further into that Lumina data, right, if we're doing some more disaggregation, we can see specific to Illinois how we got to our percentage. You can see the line of that 60% goal, that dashed green line, the current at that 57.1, and then you can see the breakdown in terms of graduate or professional degrees on the right-hand side, how much were bachelor's degrees, how many were associate certificates. You can see that data a bit more, and this is data that you can look through through past years, right, and see where we've grown in terms of certificates, associate degrees, if that percentage has grown. So this is ages 25 to 64. Obviously, you can see at the top, you can also switch it back and look at a younger range of individuals and see where that looks like. But I think, for the populations that we often serve, which does have a traditional age component, there's often the non-traditional age, or at least adult learner age in this. And so within that, it really does give a fuller story of whom we're serving and how we're serving. And so again, pushing a little bit more helps us understand a bit more about our data, but it's still probably not enough. Dr. Baber, our executive director here at OCCRL, did some more digging to look through counties. And hopefully, if you've not seen this map, I invite you to look even at the Lumina data. You can get to your actual county and you'll see exactly what we're looking at here. In fact, they don't have the map like that, how we have it. That is something that he has done himself, and it's a pretty cool map, right? You can also use the chart itself to produce something like this for not just this project, but maybe others. But by pulling through and looking through Illinois counties with the lowest post-secondary attainment tells us some more information. And so you see the red counties itself are some of our, they have some of our lowest post-secondary attainment. So, if we think again about that 60% goal, and then if we see Alexander is at 17.1%, I mean, if we know that if we can up the percentage of those individuals in that county with a credential, right, we're going to up our rate as a state as a whole. And so looking again a little bit deeper into that can help you think through a bit more, right, about what's happening, and hopefully help you think through your strategies. So hope you found your county where you're located. It's a bit of information that you now also have, but let's continue. If we want to break it down even more, we were at a conference, a CTE conference up in Chicago, and looking through the data up more specific to some of the Chicago neighborhoods, you can see that it looks different there as well, right? If you look through this first piece, right, Cook isn't necessarily cast as a lower post-secondary attainment rate. But when you look through here, right, you start to see some of that, the differences, and you start to ask the question. You can't see my mouse, but there's a orange line that kind of goes through the north to the south of Chicago, and it kind of separates these red areas from the shoreline, right? And you're like, what is that? And if you think through it, it's the Dan Ryan. And that in itself is creating, not the highway itself, but if you think through the history of Chicago and how things happen, right? It makes complete sense why there are these neighborhoods with lower post-secondary attainment rate, and right, helps us think through. Let's dig a little bit deeper. Let's find out a bit more information, and let's see how we can truly, really think about increasing our post-secondary attainment rate. If you think through what IBHE has done with their strategic plan of Thriving Illinois, it definitely has, I think, at least in written form, in narrative form, talk through the reasons again why. If you need a piece to leverage beyond ICCBs and Perkins saying that we have to do this, there's all kinds of other pieces out there that really do help us think through why, right? We have done so much to smooth the path from high school to college and career, but more still needs to be done. Too many students face barriers in getting to and through higher education. If you look at the data, it shows that there are significant equity gaps in access to early college experience, placement and developmental education, rates of retention, advancement and completion, and career outcomes. We also recognize that educational equity and economic growth are inseparable, right? It's both an equity imperative and an economic imperative that the higher education system works to bring back working adults as students, while recognizing all the other values that they bring to their family, work, and community. So I thought, as I was looking through all types of resources and information to bring to you today, I was like, oh, let's find some other pieces that are going to just, wrap it up. And it's so funny that one of the very first pieces I found was a video of some past OCCRL alums talking through exactly some of this. And so I invite you to sit back, watch. It's about a 15-minute clip of this video. It's a longer hour, 15-minute video if you want to, at a later time watch. Again, it serves as a resource that will be provided to you as well. But I want to start here and helping us think through, again, root causes around equity gaps, around that first question. And so with no further ado, I present to you doctors the now Dr. Francena Turner, as well as Dr. AJ Welton, who both served here at OCCRL, thinking through systemic equity, institutionalized racism, equity itself. And so that'll help situate us for this next portion of it. So with that said, let me jump into this video. Okay, thank you.
That will also have links to relevant resources for the CLNA process. And then the whole point of the CLNA is to help inform the development of your Perkins application. And the CLNA is supposed to be equity focused and driven. And we also would like to emphasize racial equity, because in working with community colleges throughout the state, no matter what your context is, we have found that race is the key equity issue that community colleges are often hesitant to address. And so, which is why we found it important for this webinar to really go over some key concepts and kind of break down and define what is equity and also what is racial equity.
Okay, we thought we'd start with explaining some of the things that equity is not. Equity is a way to get at equality, but it is not equality. Equality is the final goal. It's also not the same as fairness, and it's not all things being exactly the same. The way we look at equity acknowledges the myriad causes of inequalities, of inequities, and we'll discuss some of those a little bit later in the webinar. We do not all require the same supports, and insisting on providing all students the same supports creates further problems. Okay, what equity is, and especially in terms of education, is the process involved in achieving the ultimate goal of equality, as I said before, and it provides students with varied, additional, or differentiated supports that they need based on, it requires you to provide varied, additional, differentiated supports that the students need to achieve equality. And in order to recognize that there's an inequity issue, we have to think about what it means to be equity consciousness. And so equity consciousness is your awareness of the level of equity and inequity present in your institution or your departments or your staff's behaviors, policies, settings, organizations, and outcomes. So what you should be asking yourself is, how mindful and aware is my staff and my faculty about the unequal opportunities that exist here for students? Another key term that we need to talk about is deficit thinking. And so there are ways that when we want to look at equity or inequities in our institutions, we start by having very almost concrete beliefs about different populations. That's considered deficit thinking. So we might say something like, our fill in the blank students always have a hard time getting into some program, or older students might not do well in math. Comments like, well, the good students always complete these programs, it's the bad students who don't. What we want to do is pull away from the kind of thinking that attributes inequity to personal failings or cultural differences, and start thinking equity minded around things that we do have some power to control. So another question, a better way of looking at it might be, what are the processes involved into getting into a particular program, and how do our current processes affect our students by race or by gender or whichever equity subgroup you're taking a look at. In terms of looking at equity in relation to career and technical education, it just often includes a commitment to collecting the right kind of information, disaggregating it, and providing supports and resources based on the gaps or inequities in the data. It's essentially a commitment to achieving parity in educational outcomes. And again, to continue with equity in career and technical education, we're looking at ensuring equally high outcomes for all by distributing or redistributing resources, opportunities, and supports based on what students need to be successful. Removing the idea that one's race or culture will determine their outcomes, and interrupting inequitable practices, and intentionally examining both explicit and implicit biases. And that again is that piece around deficit thinking.
Thank you, Francena. So the comprehensive local needs assessment is really pushing you to think about how inequity plays out systemically at your community college. And so to think about how inequity plays out systemically, you need to look at 4 different domains. So you're not going to get to equitable outcomes if you're just focusing on the policies and structures. You're not going to get to equitable outcomes if you're just focusing on our individual beliefs. You need to when trying to address the problem of inequity, we need to look at all components of the problem. So you need to look at how our individual beliefs, so that could be our biases, stereotypes, could be creating the issue, the inequity. You also need to look at interpersonally, how we communicate to our students, how that impacts the inequity issue. Institutionally, in terms of our norms, our practices that we have always implemented. This is the way we do things around here, right? Those norms, status quo. How does that impact inequities and create inequities? And how does that impact certain student groups? Structurally, and this is our programs, our policies, our structures, how are students navigating our institutions? And are there differences in terms of opportunities based on the structures that we create? So you need to be asking questions in all these different domains to get at the inequity issue. And the comprehensive local needs assessment and all the key questions that we have asked in each section of the CLNA helps get to each of these domains in terms of looking at equity systemically. So the first domain is individual. And this is our attitudes, our biases, our mindsets, our beliefs, our ideologies. And our ideologies and biases impact our practice. And we all have them, but we need to be aware of them, right? We all have biases, but the key piece is to be reflective, critical, and be willing to be aware and conscious of them, as Francena just pointed out with equity consciousness. So the CLNA process will help us be conscious of some of the attitudes and biases that may be negatively impacting certain student groups. Institutional, or as I like to call institutionalized, right? So I've been working at University of Illinois for 9 years now. And there's in many ways I have become institutionalized. Like I have become accustomed to the norms of University of Illinois, and it's become habitual in terms of how I do my everyday tasks, my job every day. And that can be a good thing, right? Being institutionalized into the system can make your job easier. You have a flow in terms of how you do your job. But we do need to call into question our norms, just the way we do things around here, the status quo. We need to question these things. And the reason why we need to question these things is because sometimes the way that we do things around here, the way that we've done things for years and years might not be working for certain student groups, for certain subpopulations, right? And so we need to be willing to adjust and change our norms to better meet the needs of our students of color, to better meet the needs of students who are experiencing homelessness. So that is how inequities happen if we aren't willing to shift our norms to better align with what those students need. Okay, that makes sense. And this single loop learning, this comes from organizational theory. And this is just demonstrating where we get stuck within our norms and we're unwilling to change and learn something new, learn a new practice in order to better meet the needs of our students. The structural component literally is the way educational institutions are designed. So the way we design programs, processes, policies sets students in a particular pathway or direction, right? In terms of their educational opportunities and their path for life. So those decisions that we make in terms of policies, practices, programs are huge for students because it is setting up the direction that they're going in and for life. And so it's a great responsibility when we are thinking critically about how the structures that we set up impact students, especially students who come from underrepresented groups, students of color. How are the structures that we set up impacting what they get access to and the opportunities they get access to? And then the interpersonal piece is literally how we communicate with one another. And each of these domains are connected and impact other domains within the system of equity. So the individual, our biases, belief systems, our ideologies can impact how we communicate with others, right? And so this example that here is a secondary example from a high school student, where this is a student of color who's realizing that her counselor didn't give her the same information as her white peers received in terms of AP course taking and taking the AP exam. So literally, using the CLNA process to help us understand how we're communicating with certain student populations, and is the information that we're relaying, the way in which we're building relationships with students, does it differ based on subpopulation? And how does that impact their experiences at the community college level? So these are just some examples in terms of the CLNA, how thinking about equity systemically, how the CLNA process will help you think about equity systemically. So from an individual level, challenging faculty, staff, and your industry partners that are working with you to question maybe perhaps some of the implicit biases that they may hold towards racial minoritized groups, and how those implicit biases may impact decision-making. Okay, so that's just one example of at the individual level. Institutional level, remember, these are our norms. So how do our norms for recruitment deter racially minoritized groups from applying? So perhaps the way that the way you've always done recruitment, maybe it's deterring racially minoritized groups, students of color, from applying to a specific CTE program. Structural, how might our structures and practices push minoritized groups into low-wage CTE programs? So in what ways could we perhaps be tracking certain student populations into CTE programs that lead to low-wage jobs? And then that interpersonal piece, are faculty embedding culturally responsive instructional practices in the classroom? So are students of color able to see themselves reflected in the classroom, their culture and their identity reflected in the classroom discussions, the classroom curriculum, etc.?
Hello, everybody. I will now move us in a different.
All right. What do y'all think? Has anyone listened to that webinar? No?
Yes.
Yes. Listen.
If you haven't, obviously, again, it's an hour and 15 minutes long. I invite you to go even further. What they do is a good job. Again, I started at the wrong spot, but they go into, an introduction of the CLNA itself. We have quite a few videos on our site that really help discuss that. If you ever worked with Marci Rockey, Dr. Rockey over, that was here, OCCRL is now at Illinois State University. She definitely does some really good webinars, just helping you orient yourself with the CLNA. But this one particularly really looks and leans into systemic equity, racial equity, and the CLNA. And so I invite you to think about this more, but I wanted to at least make sure I level set with you all, not just the terms equity, right, but helping us think through what does this look like? What does systemic equity, racial equity look like in regards to CTE and especially within the CLNA. And so I hope you're starting to think about that. Well, recognizing that many of us came from meetings before this and we're trying to make sure that we can get and understand some key pieces from this. I'm hoping that you can, from that small snippet of information, right, help you think through, root cause. And I hope that if you were able to pull up your CLNA, you're starting to look even through how your institution answered that question or how you wrote that answer, right, to that question. And let's push on that as we keep going. All right, so another, I think, really good resource that if you have not taken a look at, right, to help you think through root cause is the NAEP, the National Alliance for Partnerships and Equity. They have a document that talks through their equity gap analysis. Particularly here, they have a 7-step process that they use where it starts with collecting data and then you're disaggregating it by, and they have some specific data elements that they put into a chart. Then they talk about creating data visualization tools using tables and graphs that help you see, right? Some differences, sometimes putting in that visual space will help you see something that might not have come about. Identifying those subgroups that show a gap from their comparison group, right? We're talking about not just the equalness, the equality of things, but the equity within that. And so it gets into these next pieces, right? Where you're identifying potential root causes that could be causing gaps in participation or performance by reviewing literature and creating a set of hypotheses for why the gaps exist. Here, it can be done at the institutional level, the program level, classroom level, right? It can be focused on a particular activity that includes guidance, counseling practices, student support services. And so within all of that, right, you're wanting to look through your root cause, again, develop some hypotheses that perhaps may or may not be your perception, right? Sometimes our perceptions of the existence of a root cause is a first step and an important first step, but it's often not sufficient. So in many ways, validating our root causes and the hypothesis within that, with those who are being impacted by it, particularly our students, is important, right? It's tempting to want to jump to implementing an intervention once a gap is identified, but we want you to stay with those reasons for the gap, because we want to then ensure that there's whatever you decide to implement, right, has the highest potential for success. And so within that, once you then conduct your root cause action research at that level of the identified subgroup, wherever that gap is, to determine what the gap is, what is causing the gap to exist. This might include interviews, focus groups, surveys to help identify why that gap even exists. I have a little piece at the bottom of your screen. It's the CTE and STEM student survey generator. The NAEP website had this, and I didn't know about this, but it was really interesting, right? It's an innovative tool designed for educators to develop surveys that effectively address equity issues in CTE and STEM programs. They already have what they've identified as 15 root causes, and then they have some open-ended Likert scale surveys that may help you, right, by getting data from your students, identify root causes. It absolutely could work, right? NAEP's a really good resource for that. So if you're not sure where to even start, this could be a great place for you to start understanding a little bit more about how they're identifying root causes, and additionally how your students are, what they're seeing, and then even doing some further research, which is what we are also here for, right? We love the research aspect of this. And then number 6, selecting an intervention aligned with the identified root causes. Obviously, if through both, the steps 1 through 5, you can get to that, you will be choosing an intervention that is aligned, right, with those identified root causes. And then step 7, be creative and use Perkins 5 funding to support these efforts. Sounds like a pretty streamlined process, right? If only it was that easy. If only it was that easy, we'd be done, right? And so I hope that you'll use this as a resource. I do think that they offer some, while brief, some really good ideas about what that might look like, and we'll kind of go through some of that here. But I wanted you to see another resource that, if you hadn't, might be something that really does help push you to that next level and thinking through root causes. Here is NAEP's, their equity and CTE/STEM ecosystem, root causes and sources of strategies. This may look like what you already have. It could build on what you already have. They identify it through education, career, community, and individual spaces, much like what Dr. Welton talked through with the individual structural other pieces. And so I want you to at least, again, familiarize yourself with this, and perhaps this might be something that helps you think through what are some identified root causes within your institution around equity gaps, but good resource here as well. So let's do just a quick activity. I think it's important to think through this a little bit further. Here, and what Dr. Turner talked through earlier, right? Identifying deficit and equity-minded pieces that we often think through. This particular exercise is just to help enhance your understanding of what that is. And this is just a shortened version of it, but I invite you to look through the Center for Urban Education's or racial equity tools. There's so many. But I thought this one might just start. Maybe this is something you could use with your other faculty and staff, your team, to help think through again, where might some of these root causes, come up. And so from an individual perspective, I'll show you a statement, and if you're inclined, please do feel free to write in the chat if it's deficit or equity minded. And I'll make sure you have the answer so I don't leave you wondering. And I did see in chat, yes, you will have access to these slides and the recording. Absolutely. Yes. So with that, the first one, you can teach students all you want, but if they're going to choose not to learn, not to show up for class, or not to follow the rules, they are going to succeed no matter what the teacher does. Does that sound deficit or equity minded? I have a couple takers. Deficit. Now no one's going to type in equity minded. They don't want to be the one, right? All right. I'll share with you the answers after we get through. The next one is, why don't we look at our department data so we can better understand our students based on race and ethnicity? Is that a deficit or equity minded statement? Okay. Seen a lot of equity minded. Next one, there are fewer Black students who graduate after 5 years because they aren't educationally prepared in the same way others are. There's very little that we can do. Deficit or equity minded? Both interesting. All right, mainly deficit. Number 7, what if we experimented with some new ways to do things based on what seems to be working and then see if the gaps close? Deficit or equity minded? All right, I can't fool this group. This is a good group. This absolutely, yes. You all, majority on each of the questions were correct, right? Run into or deficit minded statements were 12 and 7 or equity minded. Now there's some really good ones on this tool sheet that you can use again with your teams to really dig a bit deeper, right? And understanding a little bit more of not just our equity stances, but how we think through our students that could absolutely help think through some of those more individual root causes, right? And so I invite you to do some more work on yourself, right? We never are done in terms of professional development and thinking through of advancing our thinking, right? Of our students, of our institutions of education. And so I invite you to continue working on yourself, right? Because the individual space is incredibly important. More examples are within the CUE Racial Equity Tools website, which is referenced at the end of all these slides. So you will have access to that as well. But Center for Urban Education has been a huge resource for OCCRL for many, many, many years, especially as they did work with the equity scorecard. And so I invite you again to look through the many resources and then think through what types of professional development you might work with at your own institution. Right, so we know that there's some individual work to do, but we also know there's some systemic work. And a bit of my background is in assessment. Assessing student learning has been an interest of mine and some research that I've done. And so as I was thinking through root cause and looking through some older work that we've done, I thought, there's a connection here, right? And I really like this quote, right? Educational assessment is at heart an exercise in evidentiary reasoning. From a handful of things that students say, do, or make, we want to draw inferences about what they know, can do, or have accomplished more broadly. And so I'm thinking about, as you're trying to do this root cause work, how can assessment assist you in this? There's so many ways, I think. There's connections to this, not just the methods of how this goes about, but some of the evidence that's provided and put together really can help you think through some of those connections. So for instance, right, we often make causal statements. We often think through that, and causal statements here are, right, the ability to make causal claims about our impact on students and their learning. That's just a little map of what that could look like. We know that there are lots of issues of causality that are beyond the realm of considering, because we just can't randomly assign students to courses, right? We can't force our faculty and staff to teach and serve the same way and try out an intervention. We know all of these things. And so within that, there is a bit of systems thinking. There is some change management that's needed. Those perspectives absolutely can help us think through some of the ways that we've been operating or not operating, or at least assisting our students. And while this often seems very messy, as you look to the right, those concept maps and mind maps can make it just feel complicated, right? It is less messy often, but more complex. There's so many moving parts, the co-curricular pieces, the curricular pieces. This is just what happens as students move in and out through our spaces. And so we have to think about it in a different way. It'd be helpful to think about this in a different way. We need a different way to tell or make the case that what we changed or what we're doing differently, right, leads to an increase in whatever that is. In this case, it might be student learning. And it might allow for a different approach to get more impact or potential improvement. And so if you're thinking through, right, your institutional structures and your support, and you add in the student itself, right, if we are very intentional about all this, it absolutely can enhance learning. And so with that, there are many difficulties with causal statements, right? Those causal claims about impact on students and learning. Students are in and out of our institutions, in and out of programs. We make changes regularly, and they often are undocumented. We make changes in courses that then potentially add up to program level changes, which add up into institutional level changes, and we may never go back and really measure, look at the impact, assess the impact of that. Sometimes we don't even know what we even mean by saying a program, right? Life. Many of our students themselves are impacted by life, and oftentimes that changes from semester to semester. So while you might identify something here, it may look different with a different cohort of students the next semester. Again, levels at which this occurs, if it's at the course level, the program level, the institutional level. Again, lots of, there could be lots of differences and variation of each of those pieces. If it's longer than a year, it could be an absolute problem. Again, the mobility of our students, just the nature of the community college often makes it difficult to make some of these causal claims and causal statements. And then loosely coupled relationships. We understand and know that with some of these pieces, they're not going to have direct impact, but we often don't necessarily even recognize the relationships themselves. And so those that are more loosely coupled, it will be really hard to identify, again, appropriate interventions, improvements, if we're not able to make some of those tighter connections. And so a good way to maybe start with this is thinking through theory of change. How many of you have heard, thought through, right? Theory of change. Sometimes people talk about a theory of action. Here today, we're gonna say theory of change, right? Because I think there's a little bit to learn, and then you can go off into your, I like to do research, obviously, right? So you can go off and start Googling and find all kinds of things. But if you think of a theory of change, right? Why is it that we believe the changes that we make will lead to better outcomes, right? By adding a course, changing the reading, increasing more advising, right? Adding a different program. How will all of those have that desired impact? And if we think through the previous example, right, that would be enhanced student learning. And then thinking through, like, what are some of those mechanisms or levers of change, right? What is assumed in the changes we select as it relates to how our students understand and navigate post-secondary education? It's a good question. We have made it through all of even the barriers that have been just kind of unintentionally designed into higher education. How are we helping our students understand that? Oftentimes they're not as successful, right? Because there's so many things that are hidden. So oftentimes we say that, I cover the content in my course or my program, therefore the students learned it. I know that they've learned it. And if they didn't learn it, then maybe I should add on another assignment or maybe even another course, right? Is what I don't want for students, but oftentimes we do add another prerequisite on, and then we'll cover it again. Sometimes we think about providing our students with other opportunities, like a writing center or other support services. So we extend our hours, we add more staff, and we are like, this will help students. We just know it. And then potentially we say, if we have pathways and pipelines, that if we create intentional, coherent, aligned pathways, it will help our students see what we want and how to get there, and they will learn more, right? Potentially, it's also easier for us to make those more stronger causal arguments because then the outcomes are aligned and mapped throughout the curriculum. If we are able to do that, right, it should help our students, and it should hopefully help us think through where there are those barriers in the pathway itself, if it's intentional, coherent, and aligned. And so it's often what we believe. And that's kind of what Drs. Welton and Turner were talking through, right? And then if we truly believe in that, how do we get others to agree that it's what we are doing and not something else that is actually leading to what we might term, here again, as enhanced student learning? We have to track our efforts over time for sure, but we really need to tell our theory of change. We need to tell our story. What is that change story? We have to be able to justify that the changes that we made were something that we believed would enhance student learning. And then you say, how do you do this, right? Engaging in root cause analysis, oftentimes thinking of warrants and claims and arguments, right? Help get us there. I'm going to give you an example in a minute, but I think, if you're just looking at this, within each of this is the belief about root causes, why students were not learning or not meeting the outcome, and the mechanism by which the institution can help them succeed. How are you doing that? When we're looking at root cause, and if you look at your CLNA example right now, is that what you're getting at? Is that in that section, or is it something else? There's an example, my old director, Natasha Jankowski and David Marshall, one of our senior scholars, when I did some work with the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment, wrote in their book Degrees That Matter, moving to a learning systems paradigm, had this example, right? So in a review of senior capstone projects, it was noticed that graduating students were struggling with proper references to support their work, or that their evidence base is not matching the disciplinary standard and information literacy is lacking, right? Common issue with some of our students in some of their courses. And so there was an assumption made that if students hear about information literacy more often and are asked to practice it more through class assignments, they will be better prepared, right? That's a common assumption. The more we do this, right, the students will be okay. And aligned with that, there were some curricular changes, right? We provide students with more opportunities to engage in locating discipline-specific references. We cover the topic frequently in multiple classes. We provide assignments and feedback regularly in various settings. If we pair that with partnering with the library to provide supplemental support, as well as exploring other connections to this, right? Not just giving more classes, right? Not just giving more assignments and through that, right? Not through all of this, or not through those most common pieces, right? Where we just add more. Does this make sense? But if we think through our existing connections, our existing partnerships, where those are, we oftentimes can get to not just root cause, but again, use those mechanisms itself to leverage enhanced student learning. So whatever that is at your institution, what is your story? It's not just one simple thing, often that changes that. It could be, right, depending on your program or CTU program. Maybe it is something that's minor, but oftentimes it is much more complex. And we have to really think through all the pieces, because you might put in some curricular changes and then it changes the piece, the outcomes for your students, right? So then you got to go back and you got to think, well, maybe if we partner with the library, that might help as well. And then we're still seeing, maybe a gap. And then we add in this other piece. But tracking that along that path helps you really understand what are those key pieces, right, that we are trying to identify so that our students are successful. And, right, we're thinking about those equitable student outcomes. I hope that example makes sense. And I hope that we can draw more examples, especially from CTE programs, starting to see some. I got a chance to review many of your root causes identified in your CLNA. We're getting there. And I'm going to get some good examples from you all because I do think that it's important for you all to be able to see more specific examples towards CTE that can help. But hopefully this broader example will help you think through, identifying, again, those pieces in a root cause analysis that will help you get to, again, more equitable student outcomes. And so let's jump into that next question. Again, how are your CTE students performing in certain developmental courses to high wage and high demand sectors? Right, we're looking at it on subpopulations and race and ethnicity. And so, again, emphasis high wage, high demand, looking at these different pieces, right, to look at what are the key differences and what might be some of those root causes, curricular content, pedagogical practices, support services, kind of some of those pieces that we talked through. And that last example, I'm going to show a shorter clip of a different, I believe it's a different webinar that Dr. Welton did to kind of go through this specific example itself.
So this is an example of a racial equity gap. So this is a hypothetical example of a community college that is examining their developmental courses and looking at the data, the breakdown by race of percentage of students enrolled in developmental courses. And as you can see, there is the racial equity gap is that Black and Latinx students, they have high percentages of enrollment of Black and Latinx students in developmental courses. But remember, I said not just to focus on one type of data to understand the problem. So to really get a full picture of this problem, this institution is also looking at their completion rates. And looking at the students who have not completed and are no longer enrolled. So these are students who have not completed and they are no longer enrolled in this particular program, this hypothetical program. We see that Black and Latinx students are also, there is a racial equity gap. And so obviously you could make a connection that, right, a hypothesis that the overrepresentation of Black and Latinx students in developmental courses is tied to then, because they're stuck in these developmental courses, they aren't completing and they're leaving the program. So then what would this look like once you've examined data? What would this look like in the data cycle? So and obviously you've done the first step and you've collected the data. And as I said before, getting a variety of data. So you're not just relying on looking at the percentage of students based on racial subgroup enrolled in developmental courses, but you're looking at completion rates as well. So multiple forms of data. Interpreting the data and what does it mean? So you're dialoguing with as a team about the data and trying to determine what it means. And avoiding deficit or oriented explanations about the data. So it could be that there is, so you remember you're looking internally, being introspective about what's going on in the institution that could be the root cause. So it could be that in terms of what the data means, it could be that there's a lack of culture responsive instruction. Maybe there's some implicit biases, implicit racial biases in the student advising and advising students into these, tracking them into these courses. Also the placement testing and the placement processes, maybe there's racial biases in the placement testing and the placement processes and in the advising. So again, you're critically reflecting and looking at structural and institutional, attitudinal, that's the biases piece, interpersonal, your interactions with students and that advising process and placement process that could explain what's happening, what you're seeing in the data. So again, you're reviewing placement processes and practices. And then you're developing, the next step is you're developing hypotheses about what to do and what changes need to be made. And when you're doing this, again, you're avoiding quick fixes. You're trying to really treat the root cause and coming up with changes that will really address the root cause of the issue. So perhaps some ways in which you could modify the structures, programs, and even the make instructional changes would be to improve instructional capacity of your CT faculty to be more culture responsive. So maybe there's an issue that your CTE faculty don't know how to implement culture responsive practices for students of color. And so students aren't connecting to the curriculum. And so they're getting trapped for that reason, because the instruction isn't strong. They're getting stuck in those developmental courses. PD for advisors on implicit biases. So helping advisors understand perhaps their own racial biases and how that might impact how they're advising students in their course taking. Culture responsive wraparound student support services and academic support services. So what kinds of interventions and academic supports could you provide for students of color? Contextualizing the curriculum. So making the curriculum more so connect to the certification that they're getting. And also collaborating with K-12 and adult ed, not to, of course, put the blame back on K-12, but, you know, if you're seeing patterns, perhaps there could be some collaboration in terms of providing interventions and supports for students that are matriculating to you. So in conclusion, in terms of
All right, how was that example for you? I hope useful as well. I think, again, what they do is offer another way to think through, right? Identifying those equity gaps itself and getting very specific in terms of some potential places that you might want to, again, be creative, using your Perkins 5 funding to be creative and identifying and addressing some of the equity gaps itself. I could easily see some places that you might think through to use some of the funding.
So this is
So-
an example.
Let me just show you real quick. I skipped over this example. If you ever did pathways to results, which I'm sure many of you have, you know, why do we even care, right? Oftentimes you'll see a table that has number of students attempted a course, number of students completing a course, the percentage of course completion to those that attempted, right? And you'll see a total, 65%. And oftentimes what's missing is the data disaggregation, and that's what you see in this next screen, right? Because 65% doesn't actually describe broken, looking down at student populations by race and ethnicity in this gateway course, right? You see something different. You see that those that identify as 2 or more races, right, are at 44% in terms of course completion, right? That's one of the on the lower ends, and then you have white students at 74%, right? That lead to that 65%, but that is not equitable in terms of those courses completed by race and ethnicity. And so it's important for us to really dig a bit deeper and understand what that looks like. You know, if you dig even further into this, and this is all available on our pathways to results work, as you know, we often go through it with institutions as we're working with them. You can see even more differences, right? And having some more data visualization tools puts it in a different space for you to understand at both the program and institutional levels, right? What those differences are, and again, where there are inequities. And then digging further, right? Allow you to get to exactly what Dr. Welton was talking through around curricular changes, thinking through culturally relevant pedagogy and other pieces. And so again, all of this is absolutely connected, but it's important to really help think through initially, right? What are some of those root causes? And there's so many examples out there of institutions that have started to really think about how your students are experiencing your institution. I invite you to really start digging in, right, and understanding better how your students are experiencing. This is an overly complicated, but really cool visual that I worked with Dr. Winkle a few years back. And this is what they developed as their framework called the SAILS framework, and how students kind of went in and out of their institution and where they were. I wanted to understand more about where were their learning opportunities, specifically student affairs. Kapiolani Community College, a part of the University of Hawaii system, talked and went through, right? They had lots of conversations as a team about how students are moving through their institution, and they were created a really cool graphic, right, on the other end of this. But there's so much behind it that helped them understand, right, where are pain points for them, what are some root causes, right, and thinking through inequitable student outcomes that they wanted to address and make sure that they were doing something with. Sinclair Community College developed this while back. They used the Chutes and Ladders game to kind of do some almost like Six Sigma work, right? Where you're looking through and saying, where is this not working? Looking through our systems and saying, these are places that students could fall off a ladder, right? Or potentially back down. We want them to be successful. So let's really take some time to think through what some of those root causes might be that we're and leading to students not being successful in whatever their goals are. So there's lots of examples out here of how institutions have not just thought about and talked through the root cause, but then even put some data visualization in the other end of that. And so, as I told you all earlier, I looked through some of your root causes, and I have some just listed. They don't identify institutions because we would not want that. But I wanted to just show you, right, some of what you've written, right, as root causes, and then thinking through what we just talked through in this last hour, right? Could there be more that you offer? to this. And there might be some more pieces that institutions themselves might have offered. An example, right? This might just be one bullet point of 10. But there are also some of them where it was just a paragraph, right? Wasn't much more than that. Really thinking through root causes for the equity and racial equity gaps that you've identified. Perhaps you might see one on here that you hadn't thought about. And see gaps from city bus availability, right? Thinking in many ways, community. We see some gaps are related to some of the gateway coursework. Thinking through that, workforce students might be, it might be more appropriate for them to do technical writing rather than English comp. Thinking through recruitment efforts, financial assistance, curricular reforms, especially for underrepresented communities. Thinking even through the open entry process. You might work with larger employers. Thinking through gender gaps and stereotypes with gender associations of certain populations. So looking through again, your recruiting and advertising policies. I mean, quite a few varied root cause. And if you don't have any listed, I hope you're thinking and starting with, in some ways, right, that neat process of just starting to collect the data, right? And as you work through disaggregating, you're going to find some things out. And then it's oftentimes the next step is going to students themselves and better understanding why some of these pieces aren't working in the way that they might have been intended. And then putting those improvements in and then measuring that and seeing if that actually did what it was supposed to do. What do you all think about some of the gaps that you see? Jody, I see your question. Stuck in developmental courses. I don't know if, did I say that or was that written in one of the statements? Oh, from the guest speaker? Not sure. Not sure. I'd love to interpret what she was thinking at that moment, but it's something to definitely think through. Any initial thoughts as you look through these root causes? I know you don't want to critique others' works, especially if you're the one that wrote it. And I'm not necessarily asking for that, but can you see at least where they're going with that? Do you see some examples of identified root causes and what people are writing? And in many ways, what we're moving to is, as we have a few minutes left, let me know, I'll share that in a second. And thinking through what I've shared with you today, what questions do remain for you after looking through and hearing some of this conversation? What did you find helpful? What did you find least helpful? And overall, how do you plan to be creative? Has anything sparked to use some of the funding to support these efforts? Anything within this that you want to share in chat, or feel free to unmute and just let's discuss and reflect. We got about what, nine or so minutes left. Anyone? Come join me in a conversation. I promise I won't bite.
I have a question.
That's-
Maybe, and just maybe because the font was pretty small. Um, but I was actually trying to scan through some of the root causes, and because it was so compiled, I couldn't really see. But that was anything up there regarding access to technology, and internet? I don't think I saw it. I just want to,
I don't think I saw it either. And I will say, in some of the resources, maybe a little dated as well. So I definitely think that there's a space to have more conversation around that. Absolutely, especially for some more rural community colleges. Absolutely,
urban as well. I mean, we do
and
have,
urban.
yeah.
Great point. Great point. So now I'm expecting to see something on your CLNA around technology and access. Joel, you talk about sometimes identifying root causes are hard because we don't have access to students who don't show up or who leave. It's always, I mean, we could sit with that for a while. We always want access to that kind of data, especially those who leave, and we're wanting some exit interview information about why they left, so that we could make things a bit more accessible for the students who do stay, or if they decide to come back. And so you're right, it is hard. And so we rely on others' work to help us think through some of that. But that's also some information in itself, and hopefully might lead to identifying another root cause as you think through why students aren't showing up, or why they've left.
I think this is a great discussion, a starting point, but it should be a series where we discuss the insecurities our students are going through, whether it's financial, food, transportation, technology that you've mentioned before, and also figure out mechanisms to try and solve those problems. What money does the state of Illinois have that they can direct to us to help resolve some of these issues? What's happening at a federal level that the federal government's going to help us rectify these situations? We have students that can't come to classes because they don't have access to proper daycare to watch their children, or the daycare falls apart, which causes them to fall behind in their classes, so they can't continue. We have food insecurity problems. I mean, one of the biggest problems we have right now in Chicago around us is housing insecurity. I have students that come to our programs who are sleeping from couch to couch, not knowing when they're waking up the following morning, sleeping in cars, walking the street half the night, it seems, some of these kids that I've spoken to. I mean, these are serious issues that we have, and having these discussions
No, you muted yourself.
to find solutions to these. I mean, is Illinois or the federal government coming up with funding so we can say, hey, Malcolm X or city colleges, you have 10,000 students in the city of Chicago that are housing insecure. These are funds that we are going to direct to you to support this.
Bring up excellent points. Excellent points. And I'm sure your fellow colleagues on the call very much hear you, understand you, and are trying to figure out interventions that are appropriate as well to again serve students, not just at the institution, but again, community colleges are open access institutions, and so anyone can walk through those doors, and that also brings other pieces that we often have to help solve. It's a really good
What?
point.
Yeah, thanks, AD Kashal. There was, so this semester along, we're like midterm right now, and there are maybe a good 7 students that we've lost contact with already. Their phones have been disconnected. And just curious to know, like, is there like an opportunity for them to get, I don't like using the word government phones, but have access to those phones that they have a certain amount of minutes and then they turn on again, like at the beginning of the month, because we literally lose those students and those numbers are gone. And they could be great students, but there's a, life happens situation, and then we lose them. So they start with us with a phone. And if we need to reach out to them, and I'm not saying every last one of them at that immediate instance, but gradually we run into students 6 months late, 6 weeks later, 3 days later, no phone access. And so we can't reach them. And because they don't have internet, with reliable internet, we can't reach them that way either. So we
Sure.
lose students.
Those are excellent points. You know, we did some work early on and are continuing to find ways to do some, just explore with the United Way. They have a United for Alice group where it's asset limited, income constrained employees. And oftentimes these are students that show up at our campus, right? They are just above just below just above the poverty line, but don't have enough for discretionary spending. And so when we think of something like a phone, right, they might have access to it now, and then lots of things happen, and then they don't have, say they break it or whatever, and they don't have access to another one. You know, how do we support students in those other ways? And so United Ways across the country have been teaming up with community colleges and helping think through some of those things. And I wonder if there's some other connections that we can start making with, you know, other partners, other CBOs, other community-based organizations that can assist us as we identify some of these issues that often aren't ours, right? We're trying to get students to learn. That is what our main thing is, but often that is not just what we do. And so how do we partner with some other organizations, because they might have some of the resources that we don't have. And right, again, if we are creative with our Perkins 5 funding, perhaps there are some more natural connections that we're not thinking about. But if we're seeing that as a root cause with our students in terms of racial equity or equity gaps, right, this is something that we really do have to find some solutions towards. So these are all really, really good examples. I wish I had more solutions. And thank
It's
you.
the equity conversation, right?
Exactly.
This is the equity conversation. So
Exactly.
okay.
And Tina, yours is perfect, right? Thinking about how the equity plan and how this should be connected. We are still working through that and helping institutions think through that, right? It should not live alone. It should show up in many different spaces. We would love for it to show up in the CLNA. In fact, I would like to think in the next iteration, some institutions are either going to be using what they did in their equity plan within the CLNA, because I've definitely seen some CLNA in equity planning. We've been doing some work with those as well. So I love that you're thinking about how to align the work, because it absolutely should be. So with 1 minute left, I do want to just at least acknowledge that we have more of these. This was the first one, just helping and honing in on identifying root cause. We have another one scheduled in November on Wednesdays, the 12 to 1:30 around culturally relevant pedagogy and support, or pedagogy, however you term it. I don't care, just come. The second one is on utilizing data. You can see the description there. We have that Wednesday, February 5th, again, same time, 12 to 1:30. And then a third one, engaging partners, where we are really talking about all of these potential partnerships, like maybe a United Way, right? But helping us think through secondary partnerships specifically. And so join us again on those three. Invite your colleagues that might be interested, that have been on the team, the CLNA team, because we found that these three are really key in helping you think through, right, again, not just root cause, but hopefully getting to closing some of those equity gaps. And so with that, I'll share this slide, share the recording. All of the resources that we have both on ICCB's site as well as our site around CLNA are here. Continue to look through the webinars, the publications. There's probably something to fit every single need, but we're going to expand on that with these upcoming webinars. And there's additional resources like the racial equity tools that I mentioned. ICSPS has some webinars around special populations and assisting them in terms of communicating and marketing. And then we have Nate's work on their equity gap analysis that I think would be helpful. So thank you for joining me today, and we'll see you at the next one.